Hi, friends. As we wrap up this series on Christian Zionism, it is fitting to bring in a Palestinian Christian voice to talk about Christian Zionism and its impact on Palestinian Christian communities. To reflect on this, I have a conversation here with John Munayer. John is a Palestinian theologian from Jerusalem who is currently pursuing his PhD research on Palestinian theology at the University of Edinburgh. He also manages the academic journal of Palestinian Christianity at Bethlehem Bible College and is involved in interreligious efforts to promote justice and reconciliation in Palestine and in Israel. In our conversation, we discuss John's first exposure to Christian Zionism and the impact it has had on Palestinian Christianity, and also especially in a very harmful way, its influence on many Palestinian evangelical pastors in the West Bank and in Israel proper. And also for our Patreon supporters, we discuss his research on the Holy Fire or Holy Saturday. It's a practice for many Christians in the Middle East of the day of Saturday, the Saturday of Easter, and how John is trying to reflect on Holy Saturday in a political sense. Very interesting research he's doing. This is available for our Patreon supporters. So if you want to support the work we're doing, check out this conversation that I had with John about his research on Holy Saturday. But anyway, this conversation on Christian Zionism is important because we had that analysis from different theologians and pastors and so on. But it's also, I think, it's very important to see what also Palestinian Christians are saying about Christian Zionism, and also the very harmful impact it has had on their lives, and also the way they do theology and how they reflect on their relationship to the church in the West, and also the relationship to the church in the global South. I think this is a very important conversation for us to have as we reflect on Christian Zionism, and also think about the ways that we can counter that theology, a very harmful theology, and think together and work together about pursuing peace and justice in Palestine and Israel. So here it is, my conversation with John Munayer. Hey, John, welcome to Across the Divide.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So, John, we've been doing this series on Christian Zionism, and we had all of these experts and authors and academics talking about it. We also had a rabbi talking about it, and fantastic folks who discussed how they think about Christian Zionism. But then it's like it was clear to me that we need to have a Palestinian voice that could talk also about how we Palestinian Christians have been thinking and dealing with Christian Zionism. So I thought there's no one better to have than yourself, who's also been thinking about this issue in Christian Zionism, and you've been writing on it as well. So yeah, thank you for coming, and I'm very excited about this conversation we're going to have.
Thank you so much. Hopefully I can live up to that expectation.
I'm sure you will. So, John, if people are watching us on YouTube, they're going to see, it's like, wait, John, he doesn't look Palestinian. He doesn't sound Palestinian. Who is this guy? Is he actually Palestinian? So can you just tell us briefly who you are, just to help the audience understand what you do and where you come from and so on?
For sure. So I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I'm currently based in Jerusalem, but I was born to a Palestinian Christian father and a British mother. So that might explain my name and perhaps my mixed accent. And I went to an Israeli Jewish school for primary and secondary school. So I grew up in this very much mixed context in Jerusalem, having a British mother, a Palestinian father, and going to an Israeli school.
And your citizenship is Israeli as well, right? So that also complicates it even further, right?
Correct. So I would what you call a 48 Palestinian, so a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship.
Yeah, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, or what Israelis like to call Arab Israelis, right?
Correct. My father's family, they come from a city called the Lid, or in some people in Hebrew or English would say Lod. It's an old city, and our family's been there for generations upon generations.
Right, and it's also a very messy city because of it's like a mixed city, right? You have a lot of Palestinians and Israelis and Jewish Israelis live there, but also known for a lot of community tension. And I don't know. I don't know how much you want to talk about your city, but anyway, it's just for. I think also it's very helpful for people to understand that history too, because it's a bit complicated. So if you want to share anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, the city is very, very old, and it's also mentioned in the New Testament. So Peter heals in the city in the book of Acts. The city used to be a Palestinian city, but in 1948, during the Nakba, 30,000 citizens, Palestinians, were basically marched from Elid and a city nearby called Ramle, and they marched them to Ramallah in the West Bank. So they basically kicked out all of the Palestinians in the city, but some managed to stay because they hid in the church of St. George, which according to the tradition is where St. George is buried. My family and another family, the Habash family, George Habash is a famous member of that family, restored the church in 1873, if I'm not mistaken. So my family hid in the church during 1948, and that's how they managed to stay in the city. And it's much of a longer story of how they then had to survive. But that's sort of in a nutshell. And the city is also discriminated. Now there's also Israeli Jews who live in that city, but it's also discriminated by the state because it's a mixed city, but also because the Israeli Jews who are there come from Eastern backgrounds. And therefore it's known for, especially in the 80s, but still today, for crime and drug trade. So that's the city.
And also, yeah, I mean, there's so much there, John. So in 1948, this is what we call the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, where Palestinian populations were moved out. So your town, your city, Lod is an example of that, where a lot of the population was moved into Ramallah, you said, which is in the West Bank now. So you have a lot of people in Ramallah right now who are actually from what is today called Israel. So that's kind of the example of ethnic cleansing. But it's still a mixed city because of the people who hid or maybe were able to come back at some point. And now there's an unfortunate reality in Lid where there's crime and strife. And I remember also in 2021, wasn't part of my conversation with you, like when I was preparing for the conversation, but this is actually very helpful, I think, for the audience to understand the challenges of Palestinian citizens of Israel. In 2021, during the war on Gaza at the time, there was some also Jewish Palestinian kind of conflict within the city, right? If you can tell us a bit about it.
For sure. So basically what happened in 2005 when the settlements within Gaza were taken out, the settlers were asked to leave the settlements.
Yeah, the disengagement plan, right? Yeah,
exactly. In the disengagement plan, a lot of the settlers who were in these areas decided to settle in mixed cities within Israel. So cities that have Palestinians and Israeli Jews in them. So they shifted their attention, obviously, to the West Bank, which was already very much strong in terms of the settler movement, but some of them focused to mixed cities. So if you go to Haifa, Akka, Ramle, Elid, Yafa, in all these cities, there's these community settler groups that want to make the life of Palestinians very, very hard and difficult in order for them to leave. So that's one reason why there was a lot of tension in that city during 2021. But there's also a state policy basically not to take care of the crime within Palestinian societies inside of Israel. It's sort of what happened in some areas in the US when it came to crime within majority African-American areas, where the police was happy to see drug and gangs flourish. And the same thing we're seeing now in the city of Elid. And that's why it's one of the main centers for a lot of tension between the indigenous Palestinian community and the Israeli community there.
Wow, I feel like this should be a different conversation to have, but yeah, there's so much there, and like the connection you just made with African Americans, I think is so powerful. Um, but then, just because we mentioned this, like, what happened exactly in 2021, just for the audience to understand?
So in 2021, as Israel was basically trying to ethnically cleanse an entire neighborhood in Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, at the same time, they were also cracking down very aggressively on worshippers during the month of Ramadan. And it basically it was tension that was boiling for a while, and protests started to erupt both in Jerusalem, the West Bank. But what we didn't see up until 2021 is a lot of Palestinians who live in Israel participate in the protests. And in 2021, we see this. And we see that even in mixed cities. So in the city of Velid, where my family come from, you saw a lot of mobilization by Palestinians who were frustrated with the discrimination they face within the state of Israel, within this more general apartheid system. And then also, as a response, Hamas then fires rockets because basically the Israeli army go into the mosque in Al-Aqsa and completely sort of vandalize the place very aggressively. And then we saw, in a bit smaller scale than what we're seeing now, but obviously the killing of many Palestinians in Gaza at the time. So that's sort of a very brief description of what happened.
What's been happening since October 7 in Lid? Has there been any tension between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis?
That's a great question. Tension, obviously, yes, but I would say that it's very different to 2021. I think one of the reasons is that, especially Israeli society is very much scared. I know it can sound very weird given the genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. But the Israeli society was extremely scared on October 7th, and they still weren't willing to sort of go out to the streets like they did in 2021. So that's one reason. The second reason is because civil society in that cities have been much more active because of 2021, and therefore have been trying to mitigate some of these tensions and even work with the municipality. So tensions are still there, and they can erupt any second, really. But at the moment, the community there is happy to see the sort of structural, systematic discrimination of Palestinians, and of course, allowing for crime to flourish amongst Palestinian communities, because they know this is going to drive a lot of Palestinians out. And we see this. So there's lots of Palestinian Christians who are trying to buy property now in Cyprus from that city, and others who are trying to buy property in Turkey. So unfortunately...
And then, so you're pacifying the Palestinian community and then forcing them to figure out a way to leave as well, right? Yeah.
Exactly. You're facilitating them, encouraging them to leave by allowing crime to happen, by systematically not allowing them to buy property, access to education, so on and so forth, budgets. And you're basically saying, this is not a safe place for you.
Exactly. I was going to say, and also create this culture of fear. And we saw this in the north as well, of arresting Palestinian citizens of Israel for posting anything about Gaza or for protesting against the killing of children. They would just arrest them. And I think, and you're kind of alluding to this, how that's different from 2021, where there's a very strong fear of being portrayed as an enemy of the state, as someone who betrays the state. So the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who, by the way, the audience, if you didn't know, 20% of the Israeli citizens are Palestinians themselves. So there's that kind of state of fear that has taken over the majority, I think, of the Palestinian Israeli citizenship in Israel. Okay, there's a lot there. Hopefully this is helpful for the audience to understand the context. Also, there's also a limitation of what, I don't know if I should say this, but of what you can say also as well, because who knows who's going to listen to this podcast. So let's kind of transition from this to talk about Christian Zionism.
Friends, if you're enjoying this episode and want to support Across the Divide, consider supporting the work we're doing here through our Patreon page at patreon.com/acrossthedivide. By becoming a monthly supporter, you'll gain access to unpublished content and other exclusive benefits. Again, the link is patreon.com/acrossthedivide. Thank you, and back to the episode.
So let's talk now about Christian Zionism, John. So you and I grew up in evangelical spaces. I personally was not aware of how pervasive Christian Zionism was in the church in Palestine. So I'm intrigued to see how you think about it as well, because eventually it's like, whoa, I'm seeing this happening also here within our community. Initially, there was a bit of this naive kind of wave doing faith that is very focused on spirituality and personal salvation, and did not understand the power dynamics of how Christian Zionism has also entered into the Palestinian church as well. So yeah, kind of my question to you, like, how do you understand the impact of Christian Zionism locally as well, but also as a Palestinian Christian, how do you understand the larger phenomenon of Christian Zionism, and how have you kind of thought about it?
Yeah, so I'll speak very, very personally in the beginning. Because I grew up in Jerusalem, Jerusalem attracts a lot of people, a lot of Christians, and a lot of, unfortunately, also a lot of Christian Zionists, both pilgrims, but also organizations and ministries. So Jerusalem, it's really easy to find Christian Zionists. In Jerusalem, all you have to do is walk on the street, and you'll find sort of Christian groups waving a flag of Israel, or sort of trying to take pictures with soldiers, or you name it, right? The more extreme cases is you find really nutcases who, are blowing the shofar, which is a Jewish horn, trumpet type of thing that Jews only blow the shofar during their New Year, but Christian Zionists like to do it all the time. And you constantly hear these horns blowing in Jerusalem. So I encountered Christian Zionism from a very, very, very early age. And this, stirred a lot of questions in me and my three siblings who also were going through the similar experience. And it made us ask questions. And thankfully, our father is a theologian, and he sort of helped us, wrestle with some of these questions. And Christian Zionists who we would meet and would have these theologies and policies that were very aggressive and violent towards Palestinians. And that sort of allowed me to start thinking very carefully about Christian Zionism. And I would say that generally, as a Palestinian Christian, Christian Zionism is obviously a heresy. It's something that is detrimental to us Palestinians. It's what's supporting the genocide at the moment in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And it could be a matter of time before we see the same type of genocide in the West Bank, and then eventually for Palestinians inside of Israel. So Christian Zionism is part of the problem. But I do see Christian Zionism as a symptom of a larger problem, and that is Western colonialism and the Western Empire. So for Palestinian Christians, we often engage a lot with Christian Zionism because of our Christian faith and the fact that we're in Christian spaces and consume Christian news or Christian theological training from the West. And therefore, we have this sort of more closer connection to Christian Zionism. And this is also specifically the evangelical community here, or the Protestant evangelical community in Palestine. So that's just one issue I would say, is that Christian Zionism is part of this larger colonial project that we're seeing by the West, that is obviously very violent and I think in complete contradiction to the teachings and life of Jesus.
Yeah, you used a strong word there, John. You called it a heresy, which is, I think, something that we as Palestinian Christians are now getting more comfortable with calling it as such. I don't think people in the West would would be comfortable with that terminology, because for many of them, this is an issue of theological disagreement between siblings. You know, it's like, well, what's the end times? What is the Jewish going to do? Should we support Jewish people? But I think a lot of us now, especially since October 7, have come to this conclusion. This is actually antithetical to the gospel. This is actually antithetical to Jesus and what Jesus says to us. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to unpack that a bit, if you're interested in doing that, but I think it's good for people to see to understand how Palestinian Christians are thinking about Christian Zionism, because that's not the attitude that you have in the West, I think, right? I don't know if you want to kind of share some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'll share a thought about that, and then I'll move in. You also asked me, which I didn't address, about the impact of Christian Zionism on Palestinian Christians locally. So I'll
yes, for sure, for sure.
So by heresy, I mean exactly, in complete contradiction to the teachings of Jesus, to the gospel itself. Not only is it in contradiction, but it masks itself as the gospel. And therefore, it's even more of a heresy, because it's pretending to be representing Jesus's message and his life, but it's a complete distortion. It's sort of the language of the Book of Revelation, that the empire uses very tempting, very familiar language, but it's actually rotten in its core and in complete contradiction to Jesus. So in that sense, I see it as a complete heresy. When it comes to the impact on local Palestinian Christian evangelicals, I would say that the situation is pretty bad. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we would probably look at all of the Palestinian evangelical churches and pastors, right? And I'm looking both in the West Bank and inside of Israel, I would say probably most of the pastors are receiving money from Christian Zionist organizations. Not only are they receiving a lot of money from Christian Zionist organizations, but they tend to be trained in evangelical colleges in the US, which also usually have dispensational or Zionist tendencies. And therefore, some of our pastors themselves, not everyone, obviously, but many of them, either believe to a certain extent a form of Christian Zionism, or don't believe it, but are simply receiving money because there aren't enough evangelical Christians to support the local churches and pastors. So we see Christian Zionism in many ways controlling some of the evangelical churches. I don't want to generalize. There's some evangelical pastors who don't fall under that category, but I would say that the majority do. Which is a huge problem we have internally and locally. And I don't know if we, as a community that's resisting Christian Zionism, have thought through a strategy about our internal problem of Christian Zionism within the evangelical movement. So it's something, I think, for us to wrestle with.
Yeah, John, I mean, you're exposing our dirty laundry as Palestinian Christians, but we need to do this work. We need to do it. And I'm so grateful that you're doing this for us. And I have also a lot to say about this. The thing is, John, your experience with Christian Zionism was more obvious to you because you grew up in Jerusalem. It wasn't to me growing up. Honestly, the first time I actually understood Christian Zionism I was in the US for my undergraduate studies and actually met Christian Zionists. I didn't have exposure to them. Whenever they would come, these groups and missionary groups would come to the West Bank, it's always under the guise of, let's support Christians, let's have these Bible vocational schools in summer. And so it was always in this missionary context. So I never saw the shofar growing up. I never saw these kind of Israeli waving flags in Bethlehem, because you're not going to see that there. So in a way, your exposure to that was more direct and more in your face than it was for me. Now I am, and the question I think audience are thinking is like, wait, what? How could they infiltrate into the Palestinian society? How is that okay? How does that even happen? Like, how could a Palestinian do that? And I think that's how it happened for me in the West Bank, where you have these lovely Christian evangelicals who are coming and they have all this money and they come and they do these summer camps for us. And I'm a product of these summer camps as well. And they lead us in prayer and in reading the Bible, but we never understood who they were and like what and their agenda and what they were going or they're aiming for. And I think there's this. I don't know if you would if you would see it like this, but there's this attempt to control and manage the Palestinian Christians, especially through the evangelical movement, by making them this people group that is so uninterested in the political reality, by letting them focus on the spiritual thing, which is why I think I would love to unpack this more with you. Why do pastors in Palestine following into the trap of Christian Zionism is because they fell into this idea that our focus is only the gospel. Let's not talk about politics or social issues. Let's talk about personal spiritual salvation. And that's how they got co-opted, because they controlled the pastors in a way that they are unwilling or don't have the language or the theology to actually be critical about the system that exists there. Does that make sense to you? Is that kind of how you think about it as well, or I don't know?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think all these pastors are coming from a bad place. I really don't think these Palestinian pastors, but and we can think about it if we put ourselves in their shoes. They have a calling to be a pastor, for instance. They want to start a church, they want to start a ministry, and they're evangelical. They want to do it in the evangelical church. Here, there's no. The evangelical church is not recognized. Okay, so in order to get ordained, to get trained, there's a college in the US, a seminary that's willing to train me. I go to the US, spend there 3-4 years, get trained theologically, get my ordination with a specific church, and I come back to the land. I come back to Palestine, whether that be in Nazareth or in Bethlehem. And I say, okay, I want to be a full-time pastor. How am I going to fund myself? I only have 10, 20, 30, even 50, even 100 members in my church. It's not enough to sustain me and my 3 children. So I will, see if there's funding out there. And some of the funding, unfortunately, is coming from these Christian Zionist churches or ministries. And therefore, they really have, money comes with strings, and it controls the theology, like you said, where many Palestinians are focusing just on the spirituality. It also gives the pastor a lot of power, because now they have access to a lot of money and even positions that they can then employ other people. And then some of these pastors become sort of gatekeepers, one could say, and it can further cause more sort of circles of oppression. And this thing is not unique just to Palestinian evangelicals or to Palestine in general. This is a very well-known colonial tactic of basically giving the indigenous community, finding a group there within the indigenous community, giving them extra privileges, power, money, in return for cooperating with the colonial endeavor. Again, we can look at other contexts. I know you're at the moment doing your PhD in North America. We can think about how slave owners used certain African Americans to promote sort of slavery. They would even sometimes pay black pastors to promote slavery in black churches, right? This is not unique. And this is something that we have to, I think, have a strategy for, a policy, because it's at the moment we're really focusing on the West in terms of our advocacy against Christian Zionism. But I think we need to do a lot more of thinking internally about how do we deal with our dirty laundry, as you said, and because this can have really, really negative consequences. It has a lot of negative consequences to us, because then you see these Palestinian leaders and pastors in Christian Zionist organizations where the Palestinians are calling themselves, we are the sons of Ishmael and our role is to serve, Israel. This is very, very dangerous language that many are using.
Yeah, to just unpack that language, which we there was an example of that where Palestinian Christians were saying this, that we are the sons of Ishmael, Jews are the children of Isaac, and they read the scriptures in a way where Ishmael is meant to serve Isaac, obviously, because Ishmael is the son of Hagar. So we are the children of the slave, and our job is to serve Isaac or to serve the Jewish people. So it creates a very problematic kind of this theology of enslavement. Our job is to serve others. I cannot think of a more like pernicious and like violent and awful way to see yourself as a slave, really, and as a servant. Okay, well, John, this is a hard conversation to have, but I think we need to have it for sure. Yeah, so you use that language of colonial like tactic to control the Palestinian Christians, and I think it's very powerful to think about it in those terms. And using the example of slavery, I think is going to affect people as well to think about how also slaves were co-opted to fall in line and to submit and to be okay with slavery. I think also makes see some of the language that was used in South Africa as well against blacks. It's like, hey, we're here to civilize you. You're not ready. We can take care of you. You're not educated enough. I'm thinking also missionary movements. This is from my own research, how the European missionaries, when they went to North America and met the indigenous population, they're like, hey, you're not enlightened enough. You're part of a complexion where you cannot become a priest, for example, because you're not European. You don't have it in yourself what it takes to become a priest. So you always had that kind of that white Western control of the indigenous populations in what is today Mexico and so on. So I'm saying, yeah, there are examples of history of this kind of colonial mentality of controlling people and then letting them believe that they are subservient and they're below. And to see it in Palestine today is so tragic. Yeah, so the thing is, what you're doing here, John, we're not just saying, hey, Christian Zionism is a bad theology, but also Christian Zionism has affected us, like has come into the Palestinian experience as well. I don't know if you want to unpack this a bit, if you have some kind of examples. I think of one example of this, which is something that both of us spoke at, which is Cross at the Checkpoint. So there's been this phenomenon we can think, if you think of the average listener here, like if someone is listening to this, like who are the Palestinian pastors you know? They could name maybe Munder Ishaq, maybe Mitri if they've read some work, but then where are the rest of the evangelical pastors? They're not there. So an example of this is Cross at the Checkpoint, which for many people in the West, this is great. We love this. Palestinian Christians are speaking. What they don't know, which is what we know, is none of the evangelical pastors, maybe with some exceptions, show up to that conference. And that's the example, John, of like what you're saying, where they're being co-opted in a way. They're not going to show their faces at this conference because they would be worried. I don't know the reasons. Obviously, they haven't told me, but you can tell maybe they just don't want to upset the people who are giving them money, right? I don't know if you have some kind of anecdotes about this or some kind of ways to illustrate how impactful this kind of control of pastors has shown itself.
Absolutely. I mean, the more obvious ones, like you mentioned, was this language that were the sons of Ishmael that need to serve the sons of Isaac. But there was a conference filmed, and people can watch it on YouTube, of these Palestinian pastors not only saying the sons of Ishmael, but saying the Palestinian Christians were like John the Baptist. Our role is to pave the way for Jesus, who represents here the Jewish people. Right, this very much detrimental language. It's messed up in so many ways. That's one example. There's another example of a famous Palestinian evangelical pastor in Bethlehem area, who is listed as the top 50 best friends of Israel on the Christian embassy in Jerusalem's website, right? And you know who I'm talking about. I don't want to name names, but there's these figures. There's another very well-known Christian leader, pastor, who would host in Bethlehem these, not forget Christian Zionists, Jewish Zionists, people who were promoting the rebuilding of the Third Temple, right? So we have these concrete examples of Palestinian Christians, unfortunately, evangelicals, which we understand where some of the, as a Palestinian Christian, we know how bad the situation is economically, also for many of people. It's one thing to be quiet. It's another thing to betray the gospel. And I think that's where perhaps mine and your frustration with these pastors is more there, because we understand silence, as much as we can understand silence because of the threat that many Palestinians have here. So there's plenty of examples. I mean, it would be good for the listeners to research what the Evangelical Council in both Palestine and Israel have said about the genocide in Gaza. Where's their voice? There's councils.
John, usually as a podcaster, I have this obligation to explain things to the audience, but I don't want to tell them names. I don't want people to know who these people are. But yes, I mean, everything you mentioned is I know what you're talking about. This is it's tragic. It's something that is very frustrating to me. And whether the example you gave from that conference or whether the examples from Bethlehem as well, there is also, John, just for the audience to understand what makes this even more tragic. So the example of the conference you gave was in Israel. So this is Palestinian citizens of Israel. I think they are naturalized. So I think they have their Israeli citizenship, and they live among Jewish Israelis. So there is a temptation, and I think you, growing up in your environment, I think it makes sense. You went to a school where there are Jewish kids. So there's this approach of normalization of coexistence. So I understand why people would want to use Christian language about unity and about coming together to do it. So that makes sense for some Palestinians who live in Israel. Palestinian Christians, and also very evangelical ones, not the average Christian within Israel. But that's completely different in the West Bank, where you have a military occupation. So how could you even do that? That's impossible. You would think it's impossible because there's a system of occupation, versus for you, at least on paper, you're still a citizen of that country and you live among Jews. So, and also to clarify for the people, so there's a Council of Evangelical Churches in Israel. I think that's the name of it. And then there's a Council of Evangelical Churches in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But here's the kicker. It's not called the Palestinian Council of Evangelical Churches. It's called the Evangelical Council of Churches in the Holy Land, which is why don't you say Palestine? So there's one that is in Israel, and then there's one in the Holy Land, which doesn't make sense, because are you saying the Holy Land is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and not the Galilee or Nazareth? But that also shows, I'm so uncomfortable talking about this, honestly, but it just shows how problematic this is, right? You're not even willing to use the word Palestine to describe a council that exists in what the two-state solution says is Palestine, West Bank and Gaza Strip. But these are the pastors who serve in the West Bank, and they have adopted this very problematic Zionist position, and they're unwilling to call themselves Palestinians. They are called themselves, believers in the Holy Land. Anyway, and you gave examples of this. It's funny, John, because I'm having this is not an interview. I feel this is more of us venting. This is because something that is
therapy,
very real.
It's therapy.
Yeah, it's therapy for us as well. So hopefully the audience can understand what's happening. So I'm speaking more than I usually do, but also I want to get this stuff out of my chest here. Something else I want to also bring up, I don't know if you want to talk about it, which is also Islamophobia. So they have these attitudes that are very unhelpful, but also some of the evangelicals also here feed on very hateful attitudes towards Muslims, which is something that I had to also deal with, because I grew up in an environment where I realized that I have some very terrible feelings about Muslims as well. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but that's also, I think, is a product of this, I don't know if it's a colonial mentality. I think you're using that anti-colonial language, which I appreciate, but fundamentally it's an ideology of hate and rejection of the other, and it shows itself specifically in hostility towards Muslims themselves. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that as well.
Yeah. There's definitely a big problem amongst Palestinian Christians, whether they be evangelical, Orthodox, or Catholic, to look down upon many look down upon Muslims, and we think we're better than them because oftentimes Christians come from stronger socioeconomic background. It's a combination of, like you say, an influence from the West of strong Islamophobic tendencies. It's also connected to our history as well, as Christians living under the Ottomans, where we didn't have, the complete equality with Muslims. So there's a few layers to it, but it's definitely an issue we need to tackle. But you are pointing to an important problem that I think is true for these evangelical pastors we're talking about, but also for us, those who would see ourselves in the camp of very much the anti-colonial camp within the evangelical movement. And that is that the colonial sort of tentacles, they are there to control our land, our work, our spirituality, our theology, but our minds. And I don't know if this is something at least that you can identify with, but, growing up, just as you grew up in an evangelical context here, the colonial influence is so intense. And we constantly need to decolonize our minds constantly. And decolonizing our minds means challenging and disrupting certain assumptions and norms that we've been taught or we've just assumed to be true because, we read it or we listened to a Western theologian. And therefore, even in the way we battle Christian Zionism, we need to question how we challenge Christian Zionism. Are we just challenging Christian Zionism? Should we be actually trying to challenge something that's much more deep than that and see Christian Zionism as a symptom? Who do we approach? Should we be trying to convince European and American white Christians to stop being Christian Zionists, whether they be sort of more conservatives or liberals who would still, fall under the category of Christian Zionists? Should we build more alliances with the Global South? Because the Global South is much more sort of willing to do stuff for Palestine. Or should we, think about advocacy as building our own community here in Palestine? Because if colonialism's goal is to disrupt our relationship with the land and with each other and with God, perhaps the way to tackle that is to strengthen and empower the local community in their relationship with the land, themselves, and God. So there's many questions I think people like us need to really wrestle with, and the movement needs to wrestle with, because I think that there's been a bit of a too much tendency to focus on the West as our main sort of advocacy battleground, which I completely understand. But perhaps it's been a bit disproportionate to other avenues we should think about. And I actually wrote an article kind of trying to wrestle with these questions. How do we decolonize our efforts as Palestinian theologians?
Right. Yeah, I'll make sure to include this article you wrote in the show notes about decolonizing Palestinian theology or Palestinian liberation theology. So that takes us to the next question, which is, I think, where we can finish here, which is how do we respond? I think there's an effective way of responding by critiquing Western colonial language and theology, and that's been done by people from Naim Atiq all the way to Munir Ishaq and Bethlehem Bible College. These are like two different approaches, very divergent in many ways. Some of it is Naim Atiq is liberation theology, Bethlehem Bible College is more biblical theology, different kind of approaches and methodologies. But, and John, you point that out, is like, yeah, but you're using language, you're speaking in English, you're trying to not appease, but speak in a language that works for the West, try to convince the West to see you and take you seriously. But you see some limitations in that, I think, and I think you also alluded to that now here. So I think you're saying it's both and, right? You're not saying we shouldn't speak to the West, we should. But also, like, what is the limitation that you're seeing? I guess here's my question, and how can we do it better?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to kind of articulate here. And when we think about it, Palestinian Christian advocacy against Christian Zionism, specifically in the Protestant and evangelical spaces, sort of really lifted off with the first Intifada during the late 80s, right? This is when we see the rise of sort of a strong Palestinian Christian response to Christian Zionism, books, conferences. Some of our elders like Reverend Naim Atik, or our contemporaries, Reverend Dr. Munder Ishaq, who are doing amazing work. And these people are paying high prices. And I don't always think that people that listen to them outside of Palestine understand the price that these people are paying, their profits in our lifetime. And, we've been doing this advocacy super successfully. We've won the argument. Like, Palestinian theology has won the academic and theological argument completely. There's multiple articles, books, conferences where I think we present very, very strong theology. And after 40 years, we see a genocide. Now, that's not to say that this is a result of that. Absolutely not. And whether we have the power, just as a few Palestinian theologians, to change that, but we're in a genocide. And I think it does force us to question even our advocacy efforts. One of the state that did the most for us is definitely not the US. It's been South Africa, and that alliance with the global South. So I think we need to ask a few questions and about how we do advocacy. And I think that in some areas, it's not forget about the West. It's the yes and, the both and. And I think one thing we need to explore is alliances with the global South, whether they be Christian or other. It doesn't matter. It can sort of be an interreligious global South movement, where I think we need to really, I think that the global South has been a bit neglected, especially if we take into consideration how Christian Zionist theology has really settled in the global South. And another thing is investing locally in Palestinians here. The Palestinian Christian community here, like we said, we're struggling, but we have many who work with Christian Zionists, but there's also those who don't want to work with Christian Zionists, and we need to empower those young Christians. I'm involved with the Bethlehem Bible College. I'm in charge of the academic journal, which should be out next month, by the way, in English and Arabic, and I teach there occasionally. And listening to the students are afraid. I'm speaking during a genocide to 8 students, and they're telling me how they want to leave the land, how they can't sleep because they can hear the military raiding different areas around Bethlehem. Advocacy can also be focused inward, empowering these communities, empowering these young, I'm speaking like I'm in my 70s, but even younger than me and you, to really, stick to the gospel and to the principles of the gospel. And I think there's a lot of work for us to do there, because there's also a limitation how much we can convince privileged white people, and I don't mean to disrespect anyone who might fall under that category. And also there's a lot of responsibility for those who are white and privileged and in the West and decide to sort of be in solidarity with us. They also have to be extremely careful how they do that, with a lot of sensitivities, because just as we spoke, there's a lot of internal dynamics happening here, and they too can fall under the danger of sort of a white savior who then basically abuses our voice. Anyways, I said a few points at the same time, but just some food for thought for us.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I just want to unpack 2 of them. The one on the Global South, and then I want to ask you about how effective it is that kind of theological dialogue is. So this is something that has been noted by many people, especially when you look at Cross at the Checkpoint. If you look at the lineup of the speakers like 10, 12 years ago, it's completely different now. So now, for example, this last conference, which audience, if you haven't checked out our series on Cross at the Checkpoint, check it out. We have a speaker from Latin America, Ruth Padilla Divorced, a theologian who's the daughter of Rene Padilla, a very important theologian. And also we have Rene August, who's South African. So it is very clear that we Palestinian Christians are finding our allies and friends in the global South, not in the West. So that's an example of how there's a shift in in where we are, who are the people we are having conversations with. So that's an example of that. I think the example you gave of South Africa, which is, I think you were referring to the ICJ case, taking the genocide case to the International Court of Justice, and there's also, I think it in the ICC. I don't know if you noticed this, John, in the International Criminal Court, there was I think the case about is it about the occupation? I forgot, but basically you have the countries that were on the Palestinian side were these ex-colonies and from the global south, from Lebanon to South Africa, and those who are siding with Israel were the Western countries. And you can tell there's a very obvious divide between the two groups. I think this was the ICC case. But maybe I'm mistaken. So there's this thing that we Palestinian Christians, where we had tried for a long time to appease and to work with Western friends and allies, and also potential allies, we're also realizing what we can get our strength from the South. So for the audience, if you are kind of confused by John's language about the anti-colonial critique, this is us coming alongside people who have been doing that work of opposing colonial thinking in Latin America, South Africa, those who actually dealt unsuccessfully to some extent against and kind of dealt with colonialism throughout their history. So I'm seeing this in the language that we're adopting, John. I think it's given us better language to use language of ethnic cleansing, colonization. When you were talking about the mind, the control of the Palestinian mind, I immediately thought of Steve Biko. He was a South African thinker, activist, and his kind of most known quote is, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." So if you can control their minds, you can control them easily. So you're unintentionally, I think you're like, this is how you're processing this theology through in conversation with friends in the global South. So my question then to you, to the second point here, like how effective do you think it is for us to have these conversations with dispensationalists or with kind of this well-meaning liberal Christians who haven't thought about colonialism, but they're progressive enough to think about social justice? Like, do you think these conversations are helpful? Are they a waste of time? What's the most effective way to counter and address Christian Zionism, you think?
Yeah. I think it's important for us to define the problem. Because I think, especially for the audience, because I don't see it just as a Christian Zionist issue, but as a colonial issue. Therefore, the problem, Palestine is not the exception here. There's a tendency to exceptionalize Palestine, but Palestine is part of a more of a global issue, right? This is a result of British colonialism and afterwards American imperialism. And this we see in Palestine, but we see in most places in this world, right? Most of the global South does not have the same privileges. There's atrocities happening in other places that need to understand within this wider colonial, imperial, and also capitalist systems and structures, right? And like you said, it's not a coincidence. And then countries like South Africa side with the Palestinian cause. And therefore, I think there's a need to really build these alliances and movements in the global South in order to basically resist the global North. When I mean resistance here, I don't mean armed resistance. Just for anyone who has any doubts. So that's why we need to form these alliances. To what extent is it helpful to speak with these either dispensationalists or liberal Christians in the West? I don't know, and I simply don't know, because at the moment our people are experiencing a genocide after 40, 50 years of advocacy. I don't know if this is the right path, but I definitely think that it's been disproportionate until now, and I think we need to invest a lot more internally into our own community. And, we need to stop trying to get validation also from these like theologians in the West, because we have the quality and power to do it ourselves without them. And this is something that I'm trying to drill to some of the students at the college, is that you are a theologian by your own right. If you can speak and think and act in relation to God, you're a theologian. You don't need any validation from any sort of Western privileged theologians. I think we need to engage with them, but perhaps we might want to shift some of our strategies and think also Global South and also within Palestine. And I'll use this opportunity also just quickly. I know we're running out of time, but I'm co-editing a book at the moment with my brother Samuel, who's also a theologian. And we've brought together 9 Palestinian theologians, all engaging in deep and hard questions when it comes to this genocide. The title is going to be Palestinian Theology Amidst Genocide. And we're asking very difficult questions. And none of the questions have to do with anything when it comes to Christian Zionism, right? We're all thinking about internal questions that we're facing here, irrespective of the Christian Zionist movement. So I think, like you said, with the change in Crisis Checkpoint, there's also a discourse change generally within the Palestinian theological scene.
Okay, yeah, that's very good. That's very good, and I'm glad that the book is happening. I would love to include it in the show notes. It's not there, but people be on the lookout for that book edited by John and Sam. And I love your focus, John, on empowering the local community. I think that's something that, and it's a valid critique towards about us. This is an internal critique of we're trying so much to reach the West that we, is it valid to say that maybe we're also ignoring our own people? So that's something that we always have to be conscious of. And I think because your framing of this in terms of power and access and affluence and resources is very important for us, because we feel that we need to talk to the West because they have the resources, because they have the power. But in many ways, we're kind of ignoring ourselves and our own community. So that's really valid. But that also shows how pernicious Christian Zionism is, right? It's forcing us to act in such ways and to wrestle with what's more impactful, what is more pragmatic, what's more helpful, and it's a hard work to do, especially when you have so many of your pastors and leaders who are also been co-opted by Christian Zionism. So that makes the work even doubly more difficult, instead of having a unified front and a kind of cohesion within our institutions. So we don't have that. At the same time, I don't know if you're find this comfortable, but I would finish with that. If for the general audience and the majority of our audience is from the global north or from the West, and they're very attuned to what we Palestinian Christians are saying, they're very interested in helping and working with us. If you would have a word of advice to our listeners about countering Christian Zionism, I think there's a lot of helpful content here. I think it's going to be very helpful for people. But for people who are still wrestling with all of this, having said what you said, what's your word for them to what's your advice for them to move forward with this kind of conversation?
Yeah, as when you want to show deep solidarity with Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, and there's lots of really good intentional people, whether they be in the north or south, but they oftentimes can, depending on the context, but also sort of reproduce structures of oppression, whether it be because they build organizations around the Palestinian cause, and then it becomes about them and not the actual cause, or people simply interfering in some of the local dynamics. But one thing you can do is simply show solidarity and support the local church for what it is, irrespective of advocacy efforts. But it's a question I really don't have an answer. And I recently listened to an interview with Norman Finkelstein, the scholar, the Jewish scholar, who's been writing on Palestine and specifically Gaza for a while, and he also presented this as a problem that W.E.B. Du Bois, the African American philosopher and thinker, was trying to understand white racism and white supremacy. And in the beginning, he thought education is what we need in order to tackle white supremacy and white racism. And then eventually he travels to Africa and he sees how the capitalistic and how capital is involved in these thinking and structures, that he said, actually, education isn't enough. We need to focus on these structures and systems. But then he goes back to the US and he says, no, it's even beyond the question of education and structures. There's something more to it, and he doesn't actually come to an answer. So the answer is, when it comes to dealing with certain white supremacists, whether they be conservative or liberal, I don't know what the answer is for this. But this is something for the global North to figure out with the global North. With themselves, within their own community. I can do what I can here in Palestine.
Yeah. Okay, John, you're doing a lot, and I'm grateful for you and kind of your analysis. I think is very helpful, especially as we finish the series, to kind of for us to be aware of our own problems internally. I think to understand the power of the structure and how the system also impacts the way that we think. And then, but also you're opening the door for us to think creatively about making change from within with our own community and then also externally as well. John, please stick around for us. I want to talk with you more about your research. You're doing some interesting work and I want to talk with you more about it. But yeah, John, I appreciate you. I think there's a lot there for us to think about. Very grateful for the work you're doing and for your insight about Christian Zionism and the challenges thereof. So thank you for being here with me, man. It's been really good.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you also for all the work that you're doing in the US. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Bannoura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abir Shhali. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.